the feeling of having no power over people and events is generally unbearable to us. When we feel helpless, we feel miserable. No one wants less power. Everyone wants more. In the world today, however, it is dangerous to seem too power-hungry, to be overt with your power moves. We have to seem fair and decent. So we need to be subtle, congenial yet cunning, democratic yet devious. This is Tuesday, September the 12th. I'm Ron. Welcome to Storytime. And I've been reading from the 48 Laws of Power, and last Sunday we got through the 48th Law of Power. And 48 Laws of Power is a book written by Robert Greene and Joost Elfers. And so as I promised that I was going to go ahead and kind of sum up the book and sum up the way I understand the book and critique it, basically. Critique the book in terms of whether or not it accomplishes what it sets out to accomplish. And so I'm going to do that today by reading the preface, rereading, I guess, the preface of the book, because that kind of sums up the whole attitude and of the whole attitude of the book is really summed up in the preface. So this game of constant duplicity most resembles a power dynamic that existed in the scheming world of the old aristocratic court. Throughout history, a court has always formed itself around the person in power: king, queen, emperor, leader. The courtiers who filled this court were in an especially delicate position. They had to serve their masters, but if they seemed to fawn, if they curried favor too obviously, the other courtiers around them would notice and would act against them. Attempts to win the master's favor, then, had to be subtle, and even skilled courtiers capable of such subtlety still had to protect themselves from their fellow courtiers, who at all moments were scheming to push them aside. And so he brings up, throughout the book, uses the image of the courtier and the court, but he deliberately leaves out the rest of the kingdom, all of the people, the butchers, the bakers, and the candlestick makers that not only make up the kingdom, but make the kingdom work. Where are the power struggles amongst those butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers? Winning what masters' favors and subtlety and schemes and whatnot. They didn't exist. Basically, the rest of the population was not busy trying to get more power, but trying to live their life right and to be happy. Meanwhile, the court was supposed to represent the height of civilization and refinement. Violent or overt power moves were frowned upon. Courtiers would work silently and secretly against any among them who used force. This was the courtier's dilemma. While appearing the very paragon of elegance, they had to outwit and thwart their opponents in the subtlest of ways. The successful courtier learned over time to make all of his moves indirect. If he stabbed an opponent in the back, it was with a velvet glove on his hand and the sweetest of smiles on his face. Instead of using coercion or outright treachery, the perfect courtier got his way through seduction, charm, deception, and subtle strategy, always planning several moves ahead. Life in the court was a never-ending game that required constant vigilance and tactical thinking. It was a civilized war. And again, one of the most interesting sentences there is, life in the court was a never-ending game. And for the rest of the kingdom, life was no game. It was, again, about trying to be happy, trying to be productive, and trying to be good. And let's see. Today we face a peculiarly similar We face a similar paradox to that of the courtier. Everything must appear civilized, decent, democratic, and fair. But if we play by those rules too strictly, if we take them too literally, we are crushed by those around us who are not so foolish. As the great Renaissance diplomat and courtier Niccolo Machiavelli wrote, any man who tries to be good all the time is bound to come to ruin among the great number who are not good. The court imagined itself the pinnacle of refinement. Underneath its glittering surface, a cauldron of dark emotions, greed, envy, lust, hatred, boiled and simmered. Our world today similarly imagines itself the pinnacle of fairness, yet the same ugly emotions still stir within us as they have forever. The game is the same. Outwardly, you must seem to respect the niceties, but inwardly, unless you are a fool, you learn quickly to be prudent and to do so as Napoleon advised. Place your iron hand inside a velvet glove. If, like the courtier of times gone by, you can master the arts of indirection, learning to seduce, charm, deceive, and subtly outmaneuver your opponents, you will attain the heights of power. You will be able to make people bend to your will without their realizing what you have done. And if they do not realize what you have done, they will neither resent nor resist you. And a couple of issues with this is that, again, it says one of the interesting things about the book in its entirety is its lack of limits. The basically way to sum up the book is to say the ends justify the means and might makes right. And it's absolutely incorrect. That's the reason that we have niceties, and that's the reason that we try to be fair and democratic, is because we realize that ethics is important, morality is important. And throughout this book, there are no limits other than strategical or tactical limits as described in each law, that if you go too far this way or you go too far that way, that you will fall out of power, but not any type of limits in terms of your behavior. If it's necessary, you steal from people. If it's necessary, you smear people. You ruin their reputations. If it's necessary, by golly, you even murder them. And it's not a question of whether or not the murder is right or wrong, but a question of whether or not you were able to get away with it, whether or not you were able to, whether or not you did it with subtlety, etc. Like what he was saying here. And the other thing is the issue of, does anyone really want to live this way? Learning to seduce, charm, deceive, and subtly outmaneuver your opponents. And who wants to live in a world of that kind of a creation where that's all you're doing all the time, 24 hours a day? You can't have any friends while you are out scheming to get people out of your way so that you can climb the office ladder or social ladders as appropriate. It's got to be an extremely lonely way of living, and again, an extremely unhappy way of living. He always constantly in this book justifies the use of power because he says that there's only two things, or he says that there's power and the opposite of it is no power. That there's those that advocate the use and pursuit of power, and then those that advocate no power, that power should be shunned or avoided for whatever reason. And that's not the way things shape up. The opposites are not between power and no power. It is between a pursuit of power and a pursuit of morality or ethics. And as a matter of fact, a pursuit of happiness. Do you want to be happy or do you want to be powerful? That's basically what it shapes up to be. To some people, the notion of consciously playing power games, no matter how indirect, seems evil, asocial, a relic of the past. They believe they can opt out of the game by behaving in ways that have nothing to do with power. You must beware of such people, for while they express such opinions outwardly, they are often among the most adept players at power. They utilize strategies that cleverly disguise the nature of the manipulation involved. These types, for example, will often display their weakness and lack of power as a kind of moral virtue. But true powerlessness, without any motives of self-interest, would not publicize its weakness to gain sympathy or respect. Making a show of one's weakness is actually a very effective strategy, subtle and deceptive in the game of power. See Law 22, the surrender tactic. And again, so his point is that it's a battle or a struggle between those that want and pursue power and those that don't, or are between power and anti-power. And it's just not the case. It's between those that want to pursue power and those that want to pursue a good life. And another little note about powerlessness. Making a show of one's weakness is actually a very effective strategy. And one of the people that uses that, and quite obviously, but is Hillary Rodham Clinton, who ran for president and lost twice. And a little side note about Clinton is that she is like the exact opposite of her husband, who was very smooth and suave and very, again, like he's talking about in the book, very subtle. And she's exactly the opposite. She's very ham-fisted, kludgy, and obvious about the way she wields power. And she does still wield power, which interestingly enough, but she was a senator, she was a Secretary of State, and the First Lady of both Arkansas and the United States. Interestingly enough, she got all of those positions from men. She got her positions as First Lady of Arkansas and the United States by virtue of the fact that she was married to Bill Clinton. She got her Senate seat from a former senator who's passed away, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and she got her Secretary of State position from another man, the former president, Barack Obama. But in any case, what she does is, one of the games she likes to play is a game between being the powerful woman and being the weak woman. That if she gets attacked, then she can say, oh, wait a minute, I'm just a woman. How dare you attack a woman? How dare you? She tried it with Donald Trump, with him when he was in the one debate, walking around behind her. And now in her tell-all book, she says that he was stalking me. And she's trying to generate sympathy for her by portraying herself as just some little weak woman. Whereas if you actually treat her as a little weak woman, then she's going to become outraged and use that as a weapon against you, politically and socially. Another strategy of the supposed non-player is to demand equality in every area of life. Everyone must be treated alike, whatever their status and strength. But if, to avoid the taint of power, you attempt to treat everyone equally and fairly, you will confront the problem that some people do certain things better than others. Treating everyone equally means ignoring their differences, elevating the less skillful, and suppressing those who excel. Again, many of those who behave this way are actually deploying another power strategy, redistributing people's rewards in a way that they determine. Yet, another way of avoiding the game would be perfect honesty and straightforwardness, since one of the main techniques of those who seek power is deceit and secrecy. But being perfectly honest will inevitably hurt and insult a great many people, some of whom will choose to injure you in return. No one will see your honest statement as a completely objective and free of some personal motivation, and they will be right. In truth, the use of honesty is indeed a power strategy intended to convince people of one's noble, good-hearted, selfless character. It is a form of persuasion, even a subtle form of coercion. And that brings me to the issue that the pursuit of power is also fundamentally materialistic versus the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of what's moral and what's ethical, which is a pursuit that is fundamentally conceptual in nature. The materialism is the erroneous theory that the only things that truly exist are those things which one can feel or touch, and that concepts and abstractions don't exist or are irrelevant, not true. Finally, those who claim to be non-players may affect an air of naivete to protect them from the accusation that they are after power. Beware again. However, for the appearance of naivete can be an effective means of deceit. See Law 21, seem dumber than your mark. And even genuine naivete is not free of snares of power. Children may be naive in many ways, but they often act from an elemental need to gain control over those around them. Children suffer greatly from feeling powerless in the adult world, and they use any means available to get their way. Genuinely innocent people may be playing for power and are often horribly effective at the game, since they are not hindered by reflection. Once again, those who make a show or display of innocence are the least innocent of all. And again, he's wrong about this, because it's not that children suffer greatly from a feeling powerless, as it is that children suffer mainly from an inability to communicate, or at least communicate in a sophisticated manner. And that's where they end up struggling. And what they're trying to do is not necessarily get their way, but trying to express themselves and accurately express what it is that they want or need. You can recognize these supposed non-players by the way they flaunt their moral qualities, their piety, their exquisite sense of justice. But since all of us hunger for power and almost all of our actions are aimed at gaining it, the non-players are merely throwing dust in our eyes, distracting us from their power plays with their air of moral superiority. If you observe them closely, you will see, in fact, that they are often the ones most skillful at indirect manipulation, even if some of them practice it unconsciously, and they greatly resent any publicizing of the tactics they use every day. And again, this is one where he does seem to acknowledge that there are those people that act or attempt to act in ethical and moral ways, but he's very cynical about it, saying that it's really just on their part trying to gain, using morality and ethics as a tool to gain power. But it also brings the pursuit of power to what end? You need a certain amount of power. By the way, he never defines in the book. It goes undefined. And the correct definition of the word of power is the authority one needs to meet one's responsibilities. And that's where you get into usurpation and tyranny. Usurpation being the use or the using power that rightfully belongs to another, and tyranny is using power that rightfully belongs to no one. And again, and he's just being cynical about it, just refuses to acknowledge that there is anything else other than power. So, if the world is like a giant scheming court and we are trapped inside it, there's no use trying to opt out of the game. That will only render you powerless, and powerlessness will make you miserable. Instead of struggling against the inevitable, instead of arguing and whining and feeling guilty, it is far better to excel at power. In fact, the better you are at dealing with power, the better friend, lover, husband, wife, and person you become. By following the route of the perfect courtier, you learn to make others feel better about themselves, becoming a source of pleasure to them. They will grow dependent on your abilities and desirous of your presence. By mastering the 48 laws in this book, you spare the others the pain that comes from bungling with power, by playing with fire without knowing its properties. If the game of power is inescapable, better to be an artist than a denier or a bungler. And power, he's saying that being powerless and the powerlessness will make you miserable, and it's quite the contrary. Ayn Rand identified in one of her books that the game of chess is a lot of mental effort for absolutely nothing. And when I first read that, I was of two minds. On the one hand, I immediately recognized that she was absolutely correct, and she is. That it is a tremendous amount of mental effort for absolutely nothing. But it bothered me because I like to play chess. And I like to think of myself as being an intelligent man, and intelligent people like to play chess. And but I had to, in the end, acknowledge she's right. that it's a lot of mental effort for absolutely nothing. Doesn't mean I can't do it. It might still be something that I want to pursue, but it did change the way I viewed the game. I used to spend a lot of time trying to figure out different tactics and strategies and whatnot, chess-wise. And after reading that, I realized that it was not such a big deal anymore. I changed my priorities, and I spend more time doing other things than playing chess. And so you hear a lot of people today, because this book is really a reflection of, or perhaps a way of leading our American culture and try to get American culture away from being ethics and morality based and becoming amoral, and doing that by going ahead and replacing morality with a pursuit of power. One of the things you hear a lot of people complain about is having no sense of purpose, no meaning to life. Because again, if life is going to become one big giant chess game for you, and everything is about, well, if I move here, they're going to move there. If I say this, they'll say that. If I do this, they'll do that. Then at the end of the day, what do you got to show for it? What's the meaning? What's the purpose? You're pursuing power for what end? To do what, ultimately? To do something great, to do something, some kind of moral exercise, but it can't be, because we've already denied morality. We've already denied ethics. We've said that the only thing that exists is power, and that all that matters is power, gaining and maintaining power. Learning the game of power requires a certain way of looking at the world, a shifting perspective. It takes effort and years of practice, for much of the game may not come naturally. Certain basic skills are required, and once you master these skills, you will be able to apply the laws of power more easily. The most important of these skills and power's crucial foundation is the ability to master your emotions. An emotional response to a situation is the single greatest barrier to power, a mistake that will cost you a lot more than any temporary satisfaction that you might gain by expressing your feelings. Emotions cloud reason, and if you cannot see the situation clearly, you cannot prepare for and respond to it with any degree of control. Anger is the most destructive of emotional responses, for it clouds your vision the most. It also has a ripple effect that invariably makes situations less comfortable and heightens your enemy's resolve. If you're trying to destroy an enemy who has hurt you, far better to keep him off guard by feigning friendliness than showing your anger. So emotions are basically ways for the individual to know whether or not they're on the right track. And one of those emotions is anger. So if you're angry about something, then perhaps that is a something that you need to take a closer look at in terms of your effectiveness, in terms of your morality and ethics. Are things going the way you want them to go? You have certain plans in life, and your emotional responses to whether or not those how those plans turn out tell you whether or not you're on the right track. Are you reaching your goals? That's what the emotions are really about. So the idea of mastering your emotions is ridiculous on its face. Love and affection are also potentially destructive in that they blind you to the often self-serving interests of those whom you least suspect of playing a power game. You cannot repress anger or love or avoid feeling them, and you should not try. But you should be careful about how you express them, and most important, they should never influence your plans and strategies in any way. No, you just go out, love, and care for people, and if it turns out that whoever it is that you're loving or caring for is deceitful, using you in some way, shape, or form, then that's a person that you that's a relationship you need to get rid of. And go find somebody that's going to be reciprocal in love and affection. Related to mastering your emotions is the ability to distance yourself from the present moment and think objectively about the past and the future. Like Janus, the double-faced Roman deity and guardian of all gates and doorways, you must be able to look in both directions at once. The better to handle danger from wherever it comes. Such is the face you must create for yourself, one face looking continuously to the future and the other to the past. For the future, the motto is, no days unalert. Nothing should catch you by surprise because you're constantly imagining problems before they arise. Instead of spending your time dreaming of your plan's happy ending, you must work on calculating every possible permutation and pitfall that might emerge in it. The further you see it, the more steps ahead you plan, the more powerful you become. Again, life is a chess game, because that's exactly what you do in chess. You're constantly trying to imagine, if I move the knight, is he going to move his bishop? Is he going to try and is he going to be able to take the knight with one of his pawns, etc.? Are we going to have a trade, and is the trade going to be beneficial for me, or more beneficial for me, or more beneficial for my opponent? Is this move going to weaken my position in other ways? Am I going to give myself less space? Am I going to hurt myself in terms of development or time? There's all kinds of different ways to go right or wrong in chess. As one chess master once said, before starting the game, when all the pieces were lined up on the board, he looked at it and said, there they are. All the mistakes are there waiting to be made. And so again, life isn't a chess game. You have to live with other people with feelings, with plans of their own, with other people that are also seeking happiness. And that's where being ethical, being moral, comes into play. The other face of Janus looks constantly to the past, though not to remember past hurts or bear grudges. That would only curb your power. Half of the game is learning how to forget those events in the past that eat away at you and cloud your reason. The real purpose of the backward-glancing eye is to educate yourself constantly. You look at the past to learn from those who came before you. The many historical examples in this book will greatly help that process. Then, having looked to the past, you look closer at hand, to your own actions and those of your friends. This is the most vital school you can learn from, because it comes from personal experience. You begin by examining the mistakes you've made in the past, the ones that are the most grievously that have most grievously held you back. You analyze them in terms of the 48 laws of power, and you extract from them a lesson and an oath. I shall never repeat such a mistake. I shall never fall into such a trap again. If you can evaluate and observe yourself in this way, you can learn to break the patterns of the past, an immensely valuable skill. And let's see, power requires the ability to play with appearances. To this end, you must learn to wear many masks and keep a bag full of deceptive tricks. Deception and masquerade should not be seen as ugly or immoral. All human interaction requires deception on many levels, and in some ways, what separates humans from animals is our ability to lie and deceive. In Greek myths, in India's cycles, and in the Middle Eastern epic of Gilgamesh, it is a privilege of the gods to use deceptive arts. A great man, Odysseus, for instance, was judged by his ability to rival the craftiness of the gods, stealing some of their divine power by matching them in wits and deception. Deception is a developed art of civilization and the most potent weapon in the game of power. And again, does any of these qualities sound like the qualities of somebody that you want in a friend, a coworker, a supervisor, or a spouse? Not to me, and it shouldn't to anyone else. You cannot succeed at deception unless you take a somewhat distanced approach to yourself, unless you can be many different people wearing the mask that the day and moment require. With such a flexible approach to all appearances, including your own, you lose a lot of the inward heaviness that holds people down. Make your face as malleable as the actors. Work to conceal your intentions from others. Practice luring people into traps. Practice playing with appearances and mastering arts of deception are among the aesthetic pleasures of life. They are also key components in the acquisition of power. And wearing the mask that day and the moment requires such flexible approach, including your own. I don't know. I'd had something that I wanted to discuss on that. I'll have to come back to it later. If deception is the most potent weapon in your arsenal, then patience in all things is your crucial shield. Patience will protect you from making moronic blunders. Like mastering your emotions, patience is a skill. It does not come naturally, but nothing about power is natural. Power is more godlike than anything in the natural world. And patience is the supreme virtue of the gods who have nothing but time. Everything good will happen. The grass will grow again if you give it time and see several steps into the future. Impatience, on the other hand, only makes you look weak. It is a principal impediment to power. And now I'm remembering what it is that I wanted to say about the last paragraph, and this one as well, and basically the whole book. And that is that Mr. Green spends a lot of time talking about power and power and power, and yet he really is offering up techniques and laws that have little or nothing actually to do with gaining or maintaining power, and everything to do with survival, with simply getting by. And that's what putting on different masks. The truly powerful don't have to put on a mask. You look at kings and queens. Queen Elizabeth, does she need to put on a mask? Does she need to run around and pretend she's somebody else or something else than what she is? No, of course not. And most of the examples in this book are told from the standpoint, again, of people that are actually not in power, but are aiming for power, and and are really only successful not at gaining power, but at actually surviving, getting by, making sure that they don't end up with their head on the chopping block. In a lot of cases also as well, that a lot of these techniques are really are psychologistic in nature, and the problem with psychologistic is it depends a lot on the stupidity of your opponents and about their making mistakes. There's a saying in chess that you don't want to use traps, or an idea in chess where using traps is frowned upon, because using traps assumes that your opponent is going to make mistakes. Because basically, if you can get somebody into a trap, it's not so much because of your skill and cunning, but because of their inattention and blundering that has gotten them into the trap in the first place. Because anybody that's fairly astute with the game will be able to spot the trap and avoid it. And the same thing applies with the 48 laws of power in a lot of cases. For instance, the law of power that he went ahead and... where is it here? I think it was probably in the beginning. I think Law 22, was it? Where he was talking about going ahead and... There it is, Law 22, the surrender tactic. And in the surrender tactic, he had discussed or used an anecdote to support the position in which I believe it was a Chinese king who was being attacked by another king and ended up was surrounded and outmanned, and he went ahead and surrendered. And he surrendered to this king, who this king went ahead and had him become a stable boy for a number of years, and then after the second king decided that the first king had learned his lesson, basically let him go home to tend to his gardens or do whatever he wanted. Well, then the first king went ahead and gathered together an army and went ahead and at a good moment or a weak moment for the second king went ahead and defeated him. And supposedly this was an example of how surrendering is actually a powerful move, when in all actuality it wasn't. All he did by surrendering was put the other person in the true position of power. Because had that other king gone ahead and kept him on as merely a stable boy, he wouldn't have been able to rise again to power. Or if that other king had simply had him beheaded, killed him, then he wouldn't have gotten anywhere. So it wasn't so much the first king didn't come back to power simply because he used some kind of magic law, but simply because the other king blundered in and allowed the first king, off the hook, so to speak. Power is essentially amoral, and one of the most important skills to acquire is the ability to see circumstances rather than good or evil. And again, this is where he's explicitly actually now hitting a nail on the head and realizing that it's not between power and powerlessness, but power and ethics, power and morality. Power is a game. This cannot be repeated too often. And in games, you do not judge your opponents by their intentions, by the effect of their actions. You measure the strategy and the power by what you can see and feel. Well, if power, again, is a game and life is a game, then what's the point? Why bother? Why bother to try and chase power if that's all there is to it? It's like the people that say the meaning of life is fun. Well, if that's all there is to it, to life, again, it's not worth it. There has to be something more, and there is. You can measure the strategy and their power by what you can see and feel. And again, we're going back to materialism, that the only things that exist are those things which you can see and feel. Concepts and abstractions don't matter or don't count. How often are someone's intentions made the issue only to cloud and deceive? What does it matter if another player, your friend, or rival intended good things and had only your interest at heart if the effects of his action lead to so much ruin and confusion? It is only natural for people to cover up their actions with all kinds of justifications, always assuming that they have acted out of goodness. You must learn to inwardly laugh each time you hear this and never get caught up in gauging someone's intentions and actions through a set of moral judgments that are really an excuse for the accumulation of power. It is a game. Your opponent sits opposite of you. Both of you behave as gentlemen or ladies, observing the rules of the game and taking nothing personally. But he says your opponent, as though that is obvious. Who is going to be my opponent when I'm at work? Who's my opponent? Is it my supervisor? Is it my coworkers? Is it all of my coworkers? Or just some of my coworkers? And which ones in particular? Just anybody who happens to have the same goals in mind that I do? He doesn't say. No answer. You play with a strategy and you observe your opponent's moves with as much calmness as you can muster. In the end, you will appreciate the politeness of those you are playing with more than their good and sweet intentions. Train your eye to follow the results of their moves and outward circumstances, and do not be distracted by anything else. I'm going to go ahead and stop right here, and we'll call this part 1 of the summation of the 48 Laws of Power, and I will go ahead and resume on the 14th, Thursday the 14th, with this summation. There's a couple of pages left. And so until then, thank you for joining me, and have a great day.